Welcome everyone to the 2024 NFA Week webinar. My name is Carla and it gives me great pleasure to open this evening's webinar. I am an accredited Billings Ovulation Method Teacher, a user and natural health enthusiast. Our topic for NFA Week this year is Trust Your Body's Natural Signals of Fertility. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Let's also give thanks to Doctors John and Evelyn Billings for responding to the request to help couples find answers to managing their fertility in accordance to natural law. It was their generosity that has allowed for the ongoing sharing of this knowledge, a knowledge of her body that every woman should have. And it is this knowledge that we share with you tonight. Before introducing our special guests, panelists, we have a few housekeeping topics to cover. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll be able to share this recording with you in a few days' time. You are welcome to share this with your family and friends or simply revisit the content yourself. As this is a webinar, participants' videos will remain off and microphones will be muted for the duration. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A and we will endeavour to answer these questions either throughout the webinar or at the allocated question time at the end. Once the webinar is over and you go away and mull over all the fabulous information that we've covered and you suddenly think of more questions, feel free to contact Billings LIFE through our website, email or social media pages. Our contact details will be displayed at the end of the presentation. And as a little pre-test, before we get into it, here are a few questions to see what you already know or think you know about fertility and the ovulatory cycle. In just a second, a poll will come up on your screen. There's only 3 questions, so take a couple of minutes to read the questions and click on an answer. It's true or false. So read the question, click on an answer, and we'll go through the answers at the end. I can see there that nearly everybody has answered the questions. So I might actually end the poll there. And I'll go through the answers now and you can see how you went. So the first question was, a normal menstrual cycle is 28 days long. So this is actually false. A normal menstrual cycle can vary in length. It should be between 21 and 35 days long. Each cycle is unique and it can vary in length and it won't always be exactly 28 days every cycle. So the second question was, a woman is fertile for her whole menstrual cycle. The answer to this was false. A woman is fertile for a short window in each menstrual cycle. So in a normal cycle that's less than 35 days, a woman can be fertile for around 5 to 8 days. And the third one was, a woman can achieve pregnancy whilst she has her period. The answer to this is true. It is possible to conceive during menstruation if your cycles are very short. And we'll actually explain this in further detail in this webinar. So for those of you who may have gotten some answers incorrect, tonight's session will hopefully clear up any confusion and provide you with the information that you need. Just out of interest's sake, most people answered the questions correctly. So I think we have a pretty good audience tonight. Okay, so without further ado, our wonderful presenters tonight are Caroline and Clarisa. Clarisa is a GP registrar who lives with her husband and young family in Darwin, the Northern Territory. She is a Billings trainee and Reproductive Health Research Institute Fellow. She is also a board member of the Australasian Institute of Restorative Reproductive Medicine. Clarisa learned the Billings method initially just for personal use. However, after encountering patients seeking natural methods of family planning, she decided to pursue training to be a Billings Ovulation Method instructor in order to provide these patients with evidence-based information. So welcome, Clarisa. And Caroline completed her Bachelor of Engineering with honours and Bachelor of Commerce in 2015 at the University of Western Australia and started her journey with the Billings Ovulation Method in 2019 after she was diagnosed with PCOS and wanted a more holistic and restorative approach to her condition. Caroline is passionate about spreading the knowledge of fertility awareness to individuals and couples through her involvement in the Billings LIFE social media platforms, webinars, and education committee. These two wonderful women are going to share some of their personal experiences with learning and using the Billings method, as well as information about how the method works and how it can be used to manage fertility and monitor your reproductive health.
Well, thanks for a wonderful introduction, Carla. Now, Clarisa, can you let everyone know how you came across the Billings ovulation method?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually first heard about the Billings method from a fellow medical student who brought it up in a teaching session about contraception.
It must have been interesting to hear about a natural method. Did you find if any of this was taught during your medical training?
Yeah, in my experience, natural methods were often only briefly mentioned and sort of broadly discussed all together as being ineffective compared to the alternatives. And so it was really interesting in my class that day because the other student mentioned that there are actually a variety of different natural methods, some of which were not effective, and others, like the Billings method, that could be 99% effective if a couple was trained with an accredited instructor. And he mentioned at the time that that's what him and his wife have been using. And I guess that sort of stuck with me.
I must have been very fortunate to hear the testimony from your classmate. Now, tell us, how did you go to learn about the method? What was your journey?
Yeah, well, I really loved the topic of endocrinology, which is the study of hormones. And I was really fascinated to realize that these hormones I'd heard of, estrogens, progesterone, and many others, had roles all over the body from head to toe, you know, from our brains, blood vessels, skin, bones, etc. And they weren't actually only just relevant to fertility and pregnancy, which is probably what I'd previously assumed. And so then personally, when my husband, who's also a doctor, and I had to think about these questions for ourselves, we decided we'd prefer an option that wouldn't disrupt those natural hormonal processes if we could. And we decided to seek out a Billings ovulation method instructor and find out a bit more about it.
Wow. And what was your experience trying to learn how to chart your cycle?
Yeah, I probably initially assumed that because we were medical, we wouldn't have that much to learn. But in fact, I was surprised by how much new information we learnt from our instructor and things we both learnt about the menstrual cycle and about male and female reproductive health. It was a really nice experience, actually, just learning to chart the cycle together as a couple. And our instructor really made sure that my husband was as much part of the process as I was. And even now, many years later, he's still the one that keeps our chart up to date. And I guess one other thing that was really rewarding about learning to chart the cycle was identifying a peak each cycle, which indicated that ovulation had occurred that cycle. And I suppose sometimes, maybe as a doctor, I'd become really used to needing tests or scans to prove that something like ovulation had occurred. And it did really surprise me that with just a chart of one daily symptom, you could gather so much information and that the scientific evidence behind this was so rigorous.
That's amazing. Yeah. No, thanks.
Thanks for sharing, Clarisa. That's I agree with you. Endocrinology is fascinating. I know just from what I've learned, I think the human body is truly remarkable. So Caroline, let's hear some from you.
Yeah, so my journey began about 7 years ago when I noticed my periods were irregular and sometimes coming every 45 to 60 days. For me, it didn't feel normal, and so I consulted my GP with regards to it. We did further investigation and I was diagnosed with PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome. And my GP at that time advised that I should take the pill to manage it.
How did you feel about that at the time, Caroline?
I wasn't keen to take the pill as some of my friends and relatives struggled with the side effects of hormonal contraceptives, and I wanted an alternative to manage my PCOS without any side effects. And I recalled in high school, we had a guest speaker present to us that women can naturally manage their fertility by taking note of their mucus patterns. But at that time, as a teenager, I was totally grossed out by the thought of checking my mucus, but that presentation definitely stuck with me.
So at that point, after having seen your GP, what did you do instead?
I was interested to learn more, and I went and listened to a podcast which promoted the symptothermal method. I also downloaded a period tracking app, and I went and purchased some books on the subject and then try to teach myself how to chart.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear how that worked out for you, as I think that's probably an experience many people have had, where they initially hear about a natural method and then sort of try and look up and research on their own, and try and figure it out without an instructor. What was it like for you?
Yeah, it was hard because at that time I was doing fly in, fly out, and I was experiencing quite a few roadblocks trying to teach myself how to chart. Firstly, the period tracking app I downloaded was completely inaccurate in predicting my next menstruation. I also found it difficult to take my temperature at the same time every day because when I was on site, I'll wake up at 5 o'clock and then get ready for a 12-hour shift. But then on my days off back home, I was sleeping in until 9 and 10. So taking my temperature at the same time every day didn't work for me. And finally, I was confused with the significance of the mucus patterns. And by that time, I felt like I needed extra help from a teacher. So I went online and did a search, how to track my menstrual cycles naturally, and I stumbled upon the Billings Ovulation Method website. For me, I was quite impressed. There was a scientifically backed method founded by two Australian doctors in the early 50s. And so I made contact with the office and was referred to a local Perth instructor, Amanda Bowen, who taught me the method face to face.
And yeah, just for other people to hear, how did you find the experience with an instructor?
Oh, it was great because having an instructor teach me, learn how to recognize my own unique patterns made me feel reassured and confident. I learned to trust my own observations and was pleased to know that even with my irregular cycles at that time, I can still use a method and pinpoint when I had peaked fertility at the time. And I was amazed to learn that women were only fertile for a short period of time during the menstrual cycle. But it was kind of shocked me that this knowledge was not taught in school or wasn't clearly taught in the medical system. And that was the catalyst for me to become an instructor for the method. Yeah.
And Caroline, could you briefly share, what being taught by an instructor involves? How much does it cost? How long does it take usually?
Yeah, I'll gladly share. It either involves meeting online or in person with an accredited instructor, and there's usually 5 to 6 sessions over a 6-month period, and this would cost $250 altogether, and that includes the paperwork and the instructor. And instructor is a great source of knowledge on the anatomy and physiology of the menstrual cycle, and it can guide a couple or woman from absolutely no knowledge on the topic to being able to independently keep an accurate chart, and then they can use that chart to either achieve or postpone pregnancy.
Thanks so much for sharing, Caroline and Clarisa. It's always fascinating to hear other people's experiences, particularly when you guys are both teaching or training to teach, and you have the personal experience of learning yourself and quite recently too. So that's fantastic to hear. Let's hear now more about the science behind the method, as you both explain in a bit more detail exactly what the Billings method actually is.
Yeah, gladly. Thanks, Carla. For those who are not familiar, the Billings Ovulation Method was founded by Australian husband and wife team, Dr. John and Dr. Evelyn Billings, in 1953. And together, they traveled around the world to teach their method. And it's now taught and successfully used by many couples around the world.
So we're talking about a time in which there's actually little understanding in both the scientific and general community about the hormones of the menstrual cycle in the 50s.
Yeah, and after much observations and scientific studies, the Billings realized that a woman can recognize the changes of her cervical mucus by the sensation she feels at her vulva. And with that information, she can clearly identify when she's fertile and infertile. And at that time was quite amazing because the doctors and scientists at that time didn't think about asking the women about their own observations.
And I guess now people often wonder about like what using a method would actually involve, like Callum was talking about a thermometer or an app. Does it require a hormone testing device, which some people now have at home? And interestingly, the Billings ovulation method only requires learning to recognize the sensation of mucus at the vulva and keeping a chart of those sensations. So I think we've got an example chart shown here. Yeah, perfect. So this is just an example of what a woman's chart might look like over one cycle. And the purpose of that chart is just to keep a record of the sensation each day. And then with the help of an instructor, the woman or the couple will be able to tell from the chart which phase of the cycle they're in, and then if they are potentially fertile or not at that time. So I guess the thing we talked about was these 4 phases of the cycle. So what are these 4 phases of the cycle for the Billings method?
Yeah, so before we begin, all Billings teachers have this wonderful teaching tool designed by Dr. Lynn Billings, and this is called the slide rule I have up near me at the moment. So we use this tool as an easy to understand representation of the cycle of with the 4 phases. But tonight, for the ease of displaying on the screen, we will use an animated version of Dr. Lynn's slide rule. So the first phase of the menstrual cycle is menstruation, and it's represented in red. Menstruation usually lasts about 4 to 5 days, and most women are quite familiar with this. They would notice a wet sensation of blood at the vulva and can recognize that they have their period even before they looked to see that it's blood.
And so then moving on to the second phase that we can see on this chart, the infertility or the basic infertile pattern. This is a phase of infertility prior to ovulation in the cycle. It is represented on this chart as either green or yellow, and it may be felt by the woman as a dry sensation with no discharge seen at all, and that would be marked as green, or it may be an unchanging pattern of discharge with a sensation of dry or something else that would be marked by yellow on the chart. And either way, it should be an unchanging pattern. Now, as we saw that slide rule move, this phase of cycle can actually vary greatly in length, and it's the part of the cycle that's impacted by things like stress or illness, breastfeeding, other factors. And with the help of the instructor, the woman can become very confident about identifying exactly what her basic infertile pattern is. Now, interestingly, for some people, they actually won't have this phase at all, like we're talking about the short cycle. And for others, this phase can actually go on for so long that they haven't noticed any of the other phases of the cycle for a long period of time. So again, that could be while breastfeeding or due to other medical conditions.
And following on, the third phase of the cycle is the fertile phase, and it's represented by the white section and the count of 1, 2, 3. So during this phase, women will experience mucus patterns, which is different from the basic infertile pattern. It signifies the beginning of fertility. So the mucus comes from the cervix and has many functions, such as keeping sperm, helping sperm to survive and travel, and conception is not possible without the fertile cervical mucus. The fertile phase includes the mucus peak, which we mark as X on this chart, and the 3 days afterwards in which conception is still possible. So ovulation usually occurs on the peak day, which is X, or up to 2 days after peak has been identified. And regardless how long or irregular a woman's cycle is, the fertile phase is usually about 5 to 8 days long.
Now, the fourth and final phase is infertility again, and that's represented here by green and after the number 3. So the woman is infertile again from the morning of the 4th day after the peak, as we said, marked by an X. It's no longer possible to become pregnant in this cycle at this point, and in a normal cycle, menstruation will follow 11 to 16 days after that peak of fertility was recognized. It's also important to note that a proper ovulation will only occur once in a cycle. So it is possible to release more than one egg in a cycle. However, if that's going to happen, it will happen at the same time.
Mm. And so to summarize, there are 4 distinct phases of a menstrual cycle for the Billings method. It begins with menstruation, and if a peak has been identified during the fertile phase, the cycle ends at the beginning of the next menstrual bleed.
Thank you, Clarisa and Caroline. So during these 4 phases of the cycle, there are many interesting things happening in a woman's body. Clarisa, are you able to explain what is happening to the cervix and the hormones?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several hormones actually that are produced in different parts of the body, and they all work together in this coordinated manner to bring about the normal ovulatory cycle. For simplicity today, we're only going to briefly discuss 2 of these hormones. So we're going to go through estrogens and progesterone briefly. To start with, I'll go through an overview of what these levels of hormones are doing throughout the cycle, and then we'll look at some close-up images and talk about the impact of these hormones on the cervix and what someone might notice day to day. So in this diagram, we can see here, we can see the levels of progesterone are marked by the orange line on the cycle, and the levels of estrogens are shown by the blue line. And we can see how those levels correspond with an example at the top of a typical Billings chart. Now, during the first 2 phases of the cycle that we just talked about, so that's menstruation and infertility, we can see even on this diagram that both estrogens and progesterone levels are low throughout that whole time. Then during the 3rd phase, fertility, we can see the levels of estrogen starts to rise, and this is as follicles in the ovary start developing. And then at the time of ovulation, levels of estrogens fall, and we can see that orange line for progesterone starts to rise. Now, after that, in the remainder of the cycle, the levels of progesterone and estrogens continue to rise before then both falling again to the low levels of the start of the cycle, and that leads to menstruation occurring again. So we'll take a bit of a closer look now. Perfect. So here we can see just a diagram showing this is in the menstruation phase. So there's blood coming through the cervix. The cervix is open to allow this blood flow. And as we said before, the levels of estrogens and progesterone are low through this time. Now, on the next slide, we can see this is now in second phase, infertility phase. So the hormone levels remain low, but the cervix is actually closed again. So we can see that plug at the cervix. And this would be noticed by the woman as this unchanging sensation we talked about day after day. This diagram actually also demonstrates sperm cells in the vagina, and they can't get through the cervix because the cervix is closed during this phase. Now, on the next slide, we can see in the ovary, those little purple circles are indicating follicles. And so as this fertility phase begins, the levels of estrogen start to rise as follicles in the ovary start developing. The cervix is now open and producing a fertile cervical mucus. And this is usually observed by the woman as this changing, developing pattern of sensations. Now, on the next slide, we can see we have one dominant purple circle or follicle on the ovary. And as this follicle becomes dominant, levels of estrogens rise rapidly, and the sensation at the cervix changes to this distinctive slippery sensation. Next, ovulation occurs, and this is seen in this image as the release of the egg from the follicle. And around this time, the levels of estrogens from the ovary fall and progesterone starts to rise. Now, on the next slide, you can see this kind of yellow circle where that dominant follicle was before. And this is called the corpus luteum. It produces now estrogens and progesterone. Now, progesterone, among its other roles, activates the pockets of Shore that sit at the lower end of the vagina, and they change the sensation experienced by drying out there. And this is initially, so the day after the peak, results in a distinct change to no longer a slippery sensation. Now, by the 4th day after the peak was recognised, the cervix closes again and remains closed for the remainder of the cycle. The daily sensation and observation of discharge can vary quite a bit during this phase. However, the couple remains infertile for the remainder of the cycle. And so, yeah, during this 4th and final stage, infertility, if conception didn't occur, the corpus luteum begins to degenerate. It has an expiry date, and the levels of estrogens and progesterones fall, and they eventually reach the low levels that they were at the start of the cycle, and menstruation begins again. Now, if conception did occur, we'll see, instead of those hormones, estrogen and progesterone, falling at the end of the cycle, they would continue to rise to maintain the pregnancy.
Amazing. Thank you, Clarisa. That was a great explanation. So, Caroline, we know that every woman's cycle is unique to her, and that different life stages can drastically change the length and appearance of a cycle. Should we have a look at one life stage in particular?
Yeah, so thanks, Carla. Clarissa and I were discussing about earlier, and we thought about a life stage that both of us personally experience, and that would be breastfeeding. So, Clarissa, are you able to share your experience of using the method whilst breastfeeding?
Yeah, absolutely. So, going back to my own story, fast forward a few years, my husband and I had our first baby, and I was breastfeeding. And from personal experience in medicine, I knew that while breastfeeding fully, for some women, menstruation returned within 6 weeks, even though they were fully breastfeeding. And for others, it could be a lot longer, even over a year. And so, naturally, at that time, with less Billings understanding then, I thought that given these approximately monthly cycles weren't happening anymore, that I'd have to learn a whole new charting system and rules. And so I was quite surprised when we went to our instructor and she told us there was nothing new to learn. It was all the same charting, same rules.
That must have been such a relief that you didn't have to learn any new rules, especially when you're juggling being a new parent. So can you let everyone know, what were your mucus patterns like whilst breastfeeding, and what alerted you to your returning fertility?
Yeah, so my husband and I have now used the method a few times postpartum, and for us personally, it was very easy to use, but it did look different each time. So most recently, with my now almost 2-year-old, in the first year of breastfeeding, I essentially had a full year of a basic infertile pattern. For me, that postpartum period, or that while breastfeeding, it was a dry sensation and a very small amount of visible discharge that was the same day after day after day. And I kept an eye out for changes as feeds spaced out overnight, or when solids were introduced or increased. But for me, really, the pattern stayed the same for essentially the first 12 months. It was then around when I've been breastfeeding for 12 to 13 months that I noticed some changes to the basic infertile pattern. Initially, that was sort of patches of a wet sensation, and eventually a really clear peak at about 14 months of breastfeeding. And I then, of course, after the peak, had a very expected period 2 weeks later, which I was able to be really prepared for, even though that was my first bleed in, a year. And I think this was one of the really rewarding parts of using the methods while breastfeeding, because often for a couple, they can be quite unsure in this postpartum period about if and when they're ready for another child, and also unsure about if they even are fertile or when they will be fertile again. And with using the Billings method, instead of that being a time of uncertainty for us, a couple would know, and we knew the whole way along whether we were fertile or not again, and then could use that information, with family planning.
Oh, that must have been like quite reassuring to know that during that phase for you, Clarissa. We just want to show everyone the slide rule again. So Carla, can you share with us the PowerPoint? Great. Clarissa shared with us her sensation she experienced during breastfeeding. So on the screen, you can see we have the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle, except we have an interruption occurring in the basic infertile pattern phase of the cycle, which is highlighted with the white and red and 1, 2, 3, and it's got the blue outline around it. This is quite a typical chart for breastfeeding women to experience some patterns of fertility or bleeding during a basic and fertile phase. Some women may experience patterns of bleeding, which is not menstruation, before her peak, and some women won't even bleed at all until after they've ovulated. But Clarisa, in her case, she knew when a menstruation would occur as she identified a peak. And the benefits of charting and having an accredited instructor help interpret the chart means she could tell the difference between menstruation and bleeding and be prepared.
What about for you, Caroline? So what's your experience been like for you and your husband?
Yeah, from my personal experience, my husband was amazed to learn about the method, and he gained a deeper appreciation of my unique menstrual cycle. And with the knowledge, we learned to trust each other with our combined fertility, and we used it for many years to postpone pregnancy. But when we were ready to start our family, we used the rules to achieve pregnancy. And it was very effective as we conceived after only one menstrual cycle. We now have a very active 8.5-month-old baby who I am still breastfeeding at the moment.
And what patterns have you noticed so far while breastfeeding, Caroline?
Yeah, so during the first 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding, I had a basic infertile pattern of dry. And for me, it was empowering to know I was infertile during this phase, and I didn't need to worry about taking hormonal contraceptives. It was also comforting to know I wasn't disrupting my hormones or affecting my breast milk as well. Recently, my son has started solids and has been breastfeeding less throughout the day. And I've noticed patterns of fertility which interrupted my basic infertile pattern. For me, the sensation felt wet, and it was very different to my usual sensation of dry. And this alerted me that I was potentially fertile during that time. But even with these patterns of fertility, I haven't observed a peak yet, and I have not ovulated through this time since I've been breastfeeding my son. And for me, I'm still charting every day and just waiting for the signs of peak and my returning fertility.
Caroline, it's such a special time that you're in right now, and you're so lucky to be able to chart and understand what's happening with your hormones. And you mentioned that you and your husband had used the rules to both successfully postpone pregnancy and achieve. Would you like to talk us through those rules now?
Yeah, definitely. Going back to my story, one of the reasons why I was attracted to the Billings Ovulation Method was the simplicity of the rules, and I only had to rely on my mucus observations. There are only 4 rules, and no external devices are required. So in essence, there are 4 rules for the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. Clarisa and I will go through the rules for how to avoid pregnancy today. However, it's worth noting that you can use the same rules to help optimize the chances of conceiving. So we'll start with early day rule 1. Avoid intercourse on days of heavy bleeding during menstruation, as shown on this slide here in the red section. As mentioned earlier in the poll, women can get pregnant when they have their period. And the reason for this is during days of heavy bleeding, it feels wet. And this wetness may mask the sensation of fertile mucus, which feels very similar, especially when a woman experiences a short menstrual cycle with no basic infertile pattern. So if a couple chooses to have intercourse during heavy menstrual bleeds and the woman has a short cycle, the presence of fertile mucus will enable sperm to live up to 5 days in the woman. And those 5 days is enough time for ovulation and also conception to occur that time.
Yeah, and so moving on to the second rule, alternate evenings are available for intercourse when these days have been recognised as infertile. So like we said, we're going through the rules as you would use them to avoid pregnancy, but the same rules can be used differently to help maximise the chance of conceiving. So now this rule, the second rule, relies on having worked with an instructor to be able to confidently recognise your own basic infertile pattern. Once this is recognised, intercourse can occur on alternate evenings of days in which this infertile pattern has been recognised and pregnancy won't happen. Now, a very common question about this rule is, why is it alternate days and why is it only evenings? So the reason for the evenings is that you need to have enough time during the day from the morning onwards to notice what the sensation is that day and to recognize whether that reflects your infertile pattern or not. So let's say if a couple were to have intercourse that night, that they'd recognize the infertile pattern through the day, let's call it day one. The next day would not be available for intercourse as the sensation of seminal fluid would obscure recognizing the underlying mucus pattern for the following day. Let's call that day two. If then throughout day three, they again notice the basic infertile pattern, then intercourse would be available again that evening for the couple wishing to avoid pregnancy. So that's why we allow for the alternate day, because of the sensation of seminal fluid obscuring the underlying mucus pattern.
So following on, we have early day rule 3, which is shown on this chart, which is the white, the X, and then 1, 2, 3. The rule is avoid intercourse on days of mucus or bleeding, which interrupts the basic infertile pattern, and allow 3 days of basic infertile pattern afterwards, after interruption before resuming intercourse, and which is available on the 4th evening, and then continue using early day rule 2 until change occurs. So for me, this was one of the trickier rules for me to get my head around when I first learned the method. And the reason why we wait and see when we experience any change from your basic infertile pattern, such as mucus or bleeding, is this change alert us that fertility has begun. So I got this slide here, what you saw earlier. So for example, over the next few days, you may expect a changing developing pattern of discharge, which leads to a slippery sensation and followed by a definite change of no longer slippery. And this observation confirms a peak, and the peak rule will apply, which Clarisa will talk about later. But if no peak was identified, you'll be in the highlighted part of the chart, and then a woman has to wait for a basic infertile pattern to return for 3 days, 1, 2, 3, before she can resume intercourse on the 4th evening. And that's early day rule 3.
So the peak rule, which Caroline mentioned, the final rule, is that from the beginning of the 4th day past the peak and until the end of the cycle, intercourse is available at any day, anytime. So as mentioned earlier, most women will ovulate either on the peak day or within the next 2 days after the peak has been identified. So that 3rd day allows time for the egg to die and the cervix to close. The 4th morning, then intercourse is available any time of day until menstruation occurs. So personally for me, this took me a bit of time to become really confident recognizing those 3 signs of a peak that Caroline mentioned before. So that's the changing developing pattern ending in slippery and then with a distinct change to no longer slippery. Once I got the hang of it, after charting a few cycles, it became actually as easy to recognize that a peak had occurred as it is to recognize that a period had arrived. And like I was saying, even while breastfeeding without, with more than a year without any peak or bleeding, it was still just as easy to recognize again. So with those last, 2 rules, if there's a change from the basic infertile pattern, it may just be an interruption to the basic infertile pattern, and you may still be within that 2nd phase of the cycle, or it may go on to indicate that you're in your fertile phase, leading to a peak, and then the peak rule would apply.
Thanks, Caroline. So that's our 4 simple rules. And the most important thing is trusting your observations and keeping an accurate daily chart to apply the rules effectively. Caroline, can you talk us through an example of a breastfeeding chart that we might expect to see?
Yeah, gladly. Glad to be able to share. Can you share? Yep, there you go. As you can see, this is a typical chart for a breastfeeding woman. And for this woman, she has a basic infertile pattern of dry, which we see as a green sticker. Later in the chart, she notices some patterns of fertility, which indicates hormonal activity, and she marks this as the white baby stickers. She uses early day rule 3 and counts 1, 2, 3 of her BIP of basic infertile pattern of dry, And then for this couple, they can resume intercourse on the 4th evening if they choose to. Again, later in the chart, she noticed some more patterns of fertility, so 3 days, and she correctly marks it with the white baby stickers. And again, she uses early day rule 3. And the couple can choose to have intercourse on the 4th evening. And then further, she noticed some spotting and bleeding, which we mark with the red spots and the solid red stickers. And this bleeding is not menstruation, as she hasn't identified a peak yet during this cycle. And again, she uses early day rule 3, and the couple can choose to have intercourse on the 4th evening. And as you can see, for the breastfeeding woman, her fertility is trying to return, but it doesn't eventuate to a peak because she hasn't identified a changing, developing pattern of discharge, and it didn't lead to slippery, and there's no distinct change afterwards. So those are the 3 criteria to have a peak. But even during this phase of her life of breastfeeding, she's still using early day rule 3 and early day rule 2, and for her child delayed ovulation. Yeah.
And this is an example of a normal chart too. So that would be, yeah, normal in that phase of life. So overall, the purpose of this webinar tonight was just to let you know that the Billings ovulation method can be used in any stage and any phase of life, including while breastfeeding. There are 4 rules, 1 for each of the 4 phases of the cycle, as the Billings method describes the 4 phases. There's no method of avoiding pregnancy that's 100% effective, but for those looking for an alternative and those who are motivated and willing to learn the method with an accredited instructor, that woman or couple would then have those skills for their whole life and have an option with no physiological side effects. It's certainly something that I was very grateful to have stumbled across myself.
Thank you, Clarisa and Caroline. We have actually had a couple of questions come through, so I will just read through those now. We've got one question here. During postpartum, is it normal for the luteal phase to be only 7 days after the peak? Would you say fertility is back? Clarisa, would you like to answer that one?
For sure.
Yeah.
So initially when fertility returns, so if that's the first peak someone's recognized, then it can be normal to have a short luteal phase initially. So the luteal phase, I think it was how many days, did you say, Carla?
7 days.
7 days. So that would count as a short luteal phase. So once off, when fertility's just returned, that could be normal. But if it becomes a repeated pattern, then that could be a sign of an abnormality that would be worth looking into with a doctor that's trained in the Billings method or in restorative reproductive health.
Yeah, so basically, if you've identified a peak, yes, fertility is returning, but if the luteal phase was shorter than 11 days, then it was not a fertile cycle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not that cycle.
Right. Yeah. Another question we've got here is, do you have advice on finding a GP in Victoria or Melbourne who's aware of the Billings method? I've been using the Billings method for 5 years and love it. But I've struggled to find a suitable GP who is not dismissive or pushes contraceptive methods on me and my partner. And a little thanks for the great work you do comment there as well.
I can answer that one if you like.
Go for it, Clarisa.
Yeah, I think a useful place to start is an option is the Australian Institute of Restorative Reproductive Health. They have a directory of doctors, and those doctors would be trained in fertility awareness. So they may not be accredited instructors, but they will be aware of how to interpret a chart. And so that can be a helpful way to find a doctor that has done this sort of extra training. And a doctor that I know of is Dr. Mary Welch, who'll be on the directory, who's in Melbourne.
Great. Oh, and there's that beautiful 8-month-old baby we heard about before. Hello.
He's wanting his mommy now.
And we've got another question here. Someone has asked, how does it work if you are trying to achieve pregnancy?
Oh, perfect. Caroline might want to take that one.
That's a great question. If you can share the chart again, Carla, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the four phases, and then we'll go through. All right, here you go. So that's a great question. So how to use it to achieve pregnancy? So for couple trying to achieve pregnancy, they still use early day rule 1 as the same. Early day rule 2, they will still use the same rules, but on the early day rule 3, the fertile phase. So you wait until you have the slippery sensation before you can resume intercourse. So you, the last day of slippery, or anytime you feel slippery, that's when you would engage in intercourse. And then the 2 days after you've identified the peak, you engage in intercourse, and that will maximize your chance of conceiving. And then for after the peak rule, the couple can choose to have intercourse on the luteal phase of their cycle, which is the green part, just to enhance their the relationship. So that's how you would use to maximize your chances.
And I think,
yeah,
you go, Carl. I was going to
Clarisa,
say,
you can elaborate.
yeah, something I found interesting about this was that the reason for you still using early day rule 2 in that infertile phase, even though you're not trying to avoid pregnancy, is that it allows you to see when your fertile phase has started and be able to recognize exactly when you have the slippery sensation, and that's when the chances of conception are highest. And then you go as frequently as you can while it's slippery. You don't have to wait alternate days during that time, which some people have heard, to maximize the chance of conceiving in that cycle.
Thank you. And another question here, what are the 3 requirements for a peak? It was mentioned briefly. We've got here, somebody was listening and got 2 of the criteria, which was the slippery sensation and a change, and they're wondering what the 3rd one was.
Do you want to do that one, Caroline?
Yeah, sure thing. So I will just go through the criteria. So the first one is a changing developing pattern of discharge. So you have to know your basic infertile pattern. So it could be dry or it could be an unchanging pattern of discharge. And then, so that's you have a pattern of discharge which is no longer your BIP. So it's fertile mucus. That's the first criteria. The second criteria is slippery, leading to slippery sensation. And then the third criteria for a peak is followed by a distinct change, which is no longer slippery. So I give an example. So if a woman has dry BIP, it's like dry, 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 and then she could appeal damp, damp, wet, wet, slippery, slippery, and then the next day would be dry. So that's how you would identify your peak.
Yes, so the peak is always recognized the day after in retrospect. On the day after the peak, you can say, oh, I'm no longer slippery today. Yesterday was my last day of slippery, so I'll mark yesterday as the peak.
Yes, and you mark it with a X.
Yeah. And we've got another question here that goes with a comment saying how cute your baby is, Caroline. But is there an app that we can recommend to use to track mucus patterns? And I might just quickly answer this one because that's really simple. But on the last slide, we will show the womb-approved apps for charting the Billings Ovulation Method. The most common one to use in Australia is Fertility Pinpoint, which is an online charting application. But yeah, check out the slide at the end that will have all the apps. And if you've got any more questions, just contact Billings Life.
Carl, I just wanted to add actually for the person who asked about how to access a doctor who'd be able to interpret a chart.
Oh, yeah.
There are also options on the directory of some providers that can do a telehealth service to another place in the country. So that's sometimes an option for people who don't have someone in person close to them.
Yeah, great.
Do that.
Thanks, Clarisa. And there was also a typed answer that was, you can also contact the Billings Life office in Melbourne, and they can recommend a GP as well, depending on where you are.
Yeah.
Okay, so another question. A question regarding sensation descriptions. So this is pretty common. I'm new to charting and I think I'm calling my BIP wet, but tonight you described dry with some discharge. Can you clarify the descriptions, please?
Do you want to take that one, Caroline?
Yeah, sure thing. So let me look at it again. Described a discharge. So for this person in particular, you would probably have a BIP of discharge, which we would chart with a yellow, as you see on the screen. And for your description, we would say you would use your own description of what you would describe as unchanging, but it depends on how long you've charted for, because you have to at least chart at least 3 menstrual cycles before we can say this is your BIP of wet. But sometimes if you have an accredited instructor, they will probably suggest you to use a different word, because sometimes wet could in our mind it could mean like fertile mucus. So maybe you could use it.
Caroline,
Yeah.
on that, I would probably say if you're new to charting, sometimes when we're not used to tuning into what our sensation is at the vulva or using different descriptions, we can tend to think we're either dry or wet. There's no in between. But once you get used to charting, you will come to realize there is quite a degree of change between dry and wet. And generally, wet is kept for the most sort of fertile sensation just before slippery. So if you have a BIP of discharge, usually you would use some kind of word like moist or damp or sticky, or even dry but with visible discharge.
Yep.
So yeah, it just comes down to really thinking about, well, what is the sensation I'm feeling at the vulva? If you feel dry, then definitely record it as dry, but if you see discharge, then find a simple description to describe that discharge.
And I just want to add to that, it has to be like unchanging. So it feels the same day after day after day. And that's why we want to make sure that it's actually your BIP of discharge. That's why we, as teachers, would recommend you chart 3 full menstrual cycles before you can use early day rule 2 for that basic and fertile phase of your cycle.
Yeah.
Just to
and
make
I'm
sure.
going to jump in and answer the next question quickly too. Someone was saying that they're not familiar with discharge. What's the difference between wet and slippery? And that's a really good question. Sometimes you can feel really wet at the vulva, but there's no lubricative sensation. The slippery sensation is a distinct lubricative slippery sensation, and sometimes you can feel that and not even really feel wet. Sometimes they go together. So whilst they sound, especially to someone who has never paid attention to vulval sensations or tried to chart, wet and slippery can sound like they would mean the same thing. But once you start to really pay attention and practice charting, it does become quite obvious that no, wet and slippery are different sensations, and it is noticeable.
Yeah, I found that a bit tricky to get when I started learning the method too. I was like, is slippery just very wet, or like, and it was really helpful to have an instructor to kind of really ask you these very specific questions, to kind of, and it took me definitely a few cycles before I was like, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a few questions on PCOS.
Yeah, there's one for you specifically, Caroline, about how you said how being diagnosed with PCOS didn't actually affect your achieving pregnancy, and they're wondering if you did anything other than Billings to successfully conceive.
I actually consulted a doctor from Australian Reproductive, from AIRRM, and that doctor guided me through my PCOS journey. So he in particular tried to shorten my cycle length, and he prescribed me progesterone just to help shorten my cycle length. And I also changed my job, so less stressful job, and improved my diet. So those were the basic thing, less stressful jobs. So I quit my fly in, fly out job, ate healthier, and then I consulted a GP that knew how to read my Billings Ovulation Method chart, and that helped with reducing helped with my irregular cycles. And even with irregular cycles, I was still able to achieve pregnancy, because even though it's 60 days, 45 to 60 days long, I was still able to identify a peak, which is a peak fertility. And during that time, that's when you feel the slippery sensation, you're just like, yes, I want to achieve pregnancy. A slippery sensation is important. And my husband and I use those days. Yeah, hope that answered that question.
Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah.
I'll answer the next one really quickly. There's a question here about whether you need to touch inside to work out the sensation. That's a very easy one to answer. It's no. The sensation is purely what you sense at the vulva. There is no touching needed, no investigating. You don't need to, and in fact, you shouldn't be doing an internal investigation, because not only will you not get the sensation of the vulva, you'll be getting the sensation of inside your vagina, which is not what the vulval sensation is. But also, you know, you're risking introducing infection and all the rest. So it's best, you don't do an internal investigation to determine the sensation. It is just what you feel at the vulva.
Yeah.
There was one other one here, which I think we should answer quickly. I know we're running out of time, so I'm just trying to race through and pick out some questions to answer. There's one here that's saying, oh, I just lost it. Okay, that one just disappeared that I was going to read, sorry. So there is another one. When do you chart? Do you wait until the end of each day to chart, or the start of the day, or the start of the next day? That's a good question. Clarisa, do you want to take that?
Great question. Definitely the end of the day. So it's your most fertile sort of description from that day is what counts. So sometimes you might have had some parts of the day that felt dry, but then one part of the day felt wet, and that's what you would record at the end of the day. And it's the end of the day so that you have had the time from morning onwards to recognize what the sensations were for that day.
Great. So this other question was on perimenopause.
Yes.
There's a woman asking about discharge that seems to appear every few days, and wondering which rule to apply. I would suggest there that if you don't currently have a teacher to assist you with interpreting your chart, you should probably get one. But in cycles that are longer than 35 days, it's quite common to have more than one BIP. So it's quite possible that you've got another BIP that is in addition to what you already know as your BIP. And having a teacher to help you interpret your chart will be quite beneficial. So yeah, feel free to contact Billings Life and get some help with that. It's 8:29. I think we should probably, we've got one more question that I think we should answer. If you work night shift, it would be the end of your day. Oh, sorry, it's not a question, it's a comment. It would be the end of your day, for example, before you go to bed, might be in the morning. So yes, that is correct. It is at the end of your day that you record your chart.
Yeah, exactly. I've definitely used it doing shift work before, and yeah, it's the end of your day. Yeah, before going to bed.
Yeah. There's one from a breastfeeding mum, spotting instead of bleeding during menstrual cycle. Is it normal? Yes, it is normal for a breastfeeding mother to spot during menstrual cycle. A breastfeeding mother would most likely, she'll be in the second phase of a menstrual cycle, the basing fertile pattern. And as we would suggest, use early Daryl 2 and early Daryl 3 during that phase. So yes, it's normal. Yeah.
But again, if you've got any questions, get in touch with a teacher and they can help you interpret your chart. Yeah. Okay, well, we have hit 8:30, so I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for attending, everybody. We had some really good numbers tonight. I hope you found it informative. And I'm sure I join all of you for thanking Clarisa and Caroline for sharing their experiences and some fantastic information this evening. As promised, here is the final slide with our contact details. So if you have any more questions that we didn't get to answer, please jump in and contact us and let us know what they are. But yeah, there are Billings teachers all around Australia, and we do we do online consultations. So you don't need to be physically near a teacher to get one. So contact Billings Life or jump on Fertility Pinpoint online and you can get in touch with a teacher wherever you are. So thank you for your time this evening, and we wish you all a lovely rest of your month of August and year of 2024, and of course Natural Fertility Awareness Week.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.